The receipt printed at 2:43 in the afternoon. Karen was already on the phone with 911 by 2:41. That is the sequence that matters. Karen called the police before the transaction was complete, before the pump had finished, before the receipt had printed, before my wife, Nadia, had touched the nozzle to return it to the cradle. Karen called the police while Nadia was still standing at Pump 7 of the Sunoco on Crestwood Boulevard, filling our Suburban with 89 octane, doing nothing that required a police response of any kind. What Karen told the 911 dispatcher, according to the call recording that Nadia's attorney obtained 14 weeks later through a public records request, was that a woman at Pump 7 appeared to be tampering with the pump mechanism, and that she believed the woman was attempting to steal gasoline. Tampering with the pump mechanism. Nadia had been inserting her credit card. The card reader at Pump 7 required 2 attempts because the magnetic stripe reader had a worn contact. The pump attendant, a young man named David who had been working that station for 3 years and who would later provide a written statement, told the responding officer that Pump 7's card reader had been temperamental for 6 weeks and that he had submitted the maintenance request twice. Nadia had inserted her card. It had not read on the first attempt. She had inserted it again. It had read on the second attempt. She had selected her grade, lifted the nozzle, inserted it in the tank, and begun the fill. Karen, in a silver BMW parked at Pump 9, had watched this process from 30 feet away and had concluded that a black woman having difficulty with a card reader at a gas pump was tampering with the pump mechanism and attempting to steal gasoline. She had called 911. The officer arrived at 2:57. Officer James Reeves, 14 years with the Crestwood Township Police Department, who had the specific quality of a law enforcement professional who reads a situation accurately within 30 seconds of arrival, and who, by his own subsequent account, had read this one by the time he walked from his cruiser to Pump 7. By 2:57, Nadia had finished filling the tank. The pump had printed the receipt at 2:43. The receipt showed the transaction, $67.42, charged to the Visa card ending in 4891, approved, complete. She was standing beside our Suburban holding the receipt when Officer Reeves arrived. He looked at the receipt, he looked at Nadia, he looked at the pump, which had returned to its idle state, he looked at the receipt again. Then he looked at Karen, who had gotten out of her BMW and was standing at the edge of the pump island with the expression of a person who has called the police and expects the police to do something. Officer Reeves said, later, in the written statement he provided to Nadia's attorney, that the receipt was the clearest possible documentation that no theft had occurred, that the transaction had been completed and paid for before he arrived, and that the call had been, in his professional assessment, without factual basis. He also said, in that statement, that his first response upon reading the receipt had been to look at his partner, Officer Sandra Kim, who had arrived in a second unit, and that both of them had, in his words, struggled to maintain appropriate professional composure. He said the receipt showed $67.42. He said the receipt showed an approved Visa transaction. He said the receipt was time-stamped 2:43. He said the 911 call had been made at 2:41. Karen had called the police 2 minutes before the transaction was complete, while the pump was still running, to report a theft that had not occurred, could not yet have occurred, and would not occur. She had called the police on a woman who was in the process of legally purchasing gasoline with her credit card, which had been approved. What happened in the 14 weeks after 2:43 on that Tuesday afternoon, what Nadia did, what I did, what our attorney found when she reviewed the 911 call recording, what the documentation produced, and what Karen ultimately faced when the full weight of a false police report and its specific legal dimensions became clear. None of that was about the gas station. The gas station was just the Tuesday afternoon Karen made the worst documented false assumption of her life. The receipt was the document that proved it. And the receipt was in Nadia's hand when the police arrived. My name is Solomon Reeves, 47 years old, 20 years as a licensed forensic accountant, the last 9 running my own practice. I examine financial records for a living. I find what the numbers actually say when someone hopes you will not look carefully enough to find it. My wife Nadia is a civil rights attorney. She has spent 18 years in practice. She has handled cases involving unlawful stops, false reports, racial profiling, and the specific legal consequences of calling law enforcement on people without factual basis. She had handled those cases for other people for 18 years. On a Tuesday afternoon at 2:41, she became the subject of one. We had moved to Crestwood Township 14 months before this story begins. A 4-bedroom colonial in a 41-home HOA, Thornfield Crossing, established neighborhood, the kind of community where the houses were well maintained and the residents had, generally, lived long enough in close proximity to understand how neighbors were supposed to treat each other. Karen Whitmore Aldridge had lived in Thornfield Crossing for 6 years. She was 56, former pharmaceutical sales executive, and had the organized social energy of a person who had spent decades in relationship-dependent sales work and had transferred those skills entirely to the management of her residential environment. We had met Karen at the welcome gathering the HOA organized for new residents. She had been warm and organized and had offered, within the first 15 minutes of the conversation, to share her recommendations for local services. She had given Nadia a laminated card with the names and numbers of her preferred contractors, her preferred dry cleaner, her preferred grocery delivery service, and her preferred nail salon. The laminated card had struck me as an unusual level of preparation for a first meeting, but I had not said so. The first indication that the situation was going to be more complicated than a laminated card had come at month 2, when Karen had called our HOA board president, a retired teacher named Patricia Ose, who had been running the board for 4 years with the patient firmness of someone accustomed to managing people with competing needs, to ask whether our trash cans had been returned to the proper position after the Tuesday pickup. They had been. I had moved them myself. Patricia had confirmed this when she checked. The second indication had come at month 4, when Karen had submitted a complaint to the board alleging that our landscaping contractor had left equipment on the common area for an extended period. The equipment had been a leaf blower, left for approximately 12 minutes while the contractor retrieved his truck from the street. The board had reviewed security camera footage, confirmed the 12-minute duration, and dismissed the complaint. By month 8, Karen had filed 7 complaints with the HOA. All 7 had been reviewed. All 7 had been dismissed. Patricia had called me after the 7th to tell me she was keeping the complete file because the pattern was documentable. I had been keeping my own file since month 3. 20 years of forensic accounting had given me a reflexive and professional relationship with documentation. If something is happening in a pattern, you document the pattern. If you document the pattern, you have it when you need it. By month 14, my documentation file had 61 entries. The gas station incident was not the first incident that had taken place outside the HOA context. It was the most significant, but it had been preceded by several that established the character of Karen's behavior in non-HOA settings. At month 6, Karen had been behind Nadia in the line at the pharmacy and had told the pharmacist, in a voice that carried to Nadia and to 2 other customers, that she hoped there was no confusion about the prescription, an observation that had no conversational context other than Nadia's presence at the counter. At month 9, Karen had been in the school parking lot when Nadia was picking up our daughter and had flagged down a school security officer to report that a vehicle, ours, was parked in a way that she believed violated the school's traffic protocol. It was not. Nadia had been in a designated pickup lane. The security officer had confirmed this. At month 11, Karen had told a mutual acquaintance at a neighborhood gathering that she had concerns about the people who had moved into the house on Thornfield Court, a description that applied to us and to no other recently arrived household. Nadia documented all of these. She had been handling civil rights cases for 18 years. She knew what a pattern looked like. She also knew, with the professional understanding of someone who had litigated these cases, what it required to do something meaningful with a pattern. The documentation, the sequence, the specificity, and the precipitating event that converted a pattern of concerning behavior into a legally actionable record. The gas station was the precipitating event. I was at my office when Nadia called me at 3:04. She was still in the Sunoco parking lot. Officer Reeves had taken her statement. Officer Kim had spoken with Karen. The situation was winding down in the sense that no arrest had been made and no further police action was anticipated, but it was also not over in any of the senses that mattered. Nadia's voice, when she called me, had the specific quality it takes in professional contexts: controlled, organized, the voice of an attorney processing a situation rather than experiencing it. She said, "Karen called 911 on me at the gas station." I said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I'm fine. The officer has the receipt. He confirmed the transaction was completed and paid before he arrived." I said, "Where is Karen?" She said, "Still here. Officer Kim is speaking with her." I said, "Stay there until the officers leave. Don't speak to Karen." She said, "I know." I said, "Get everything on the record that you can get on the record while you're there." She said, "Already done. Officer Reeves has my complete statement. I've photographed the pump, the receipt, and Karen's vehicle with the plate visible." I said, "What's the plate?" She read it to me. I wrote it down. I said, "I'll call Renata." Renata Washington was Nadia's colleague and our personal attorney for matters involving civil rights and property issues. She had been handling our HOA documentation since month 6 at Nadia's request, because Nadia understood both too well and too personally to be her own attorney. Renata answered on the second ring. I told her what Nadia had told me. She was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said she called 911 before the transaction was complete. I said the call was at 2:41, the receipt printed at 2:43. She said, "That's the most important fact in this situation." I said, "I know." She said, "Where is Nadia now?" I said, "Still at the station. Officers are there." She said, "Tell her not to leave until she has the officer's card and badge number, and tell her to ask, politely, whether the 911 call recording will be available through a public records request." I called Nadia back. She had already asked. Officer Reeves had told her yes, a public records request would be the appropriate mechanism, and he had given her his card. By the time I arrived at the Sunoco at 3:22, Karen had left. Officer Reeves and Officer Kim had completed their reports and were preparing to leave. I spoke with Officer Reeves briefly. He was professional and measured and said what he could say in an official capacity, which was not much, but his expression when I mentioned the 2-minute gap between the 911 call and the receipt timestamp was the expression of a man confirming something he had already assessed. David, the pump attendant, was at the station entrance. He had watched the entire sequence. I asked if he would be willing to provide a written statement. He said yes, without hesitation. I gave him Renata's card. Nadia and I drove home in separate cars. I followed her. At a stoplight, I watched her hands on her steering wheel and thought about 18 years of her handling this for other people, and about how the thing you spend your career managing looks different when it is you. At home, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. Our daughter Maya, who was 12, came downstairs and looked at her mother's face and said, "What happened?" Nadia said, "Something I'm going to handle." Maya said, "Was it Karen?" Children who grow up in households where parents are lawyers develop a specific observational acuity. Maya had been watching the Karen situation for 14 months with the pattern recognition of a child who understands more than adults assume. Nadia said, "Yes." Maya said, "Are you going to sue her?" Nadia said, "I'm going to handle it." Maya went back upstairs. Nadia looked at me. She said, "2 minutes." I said, "2 minutes." She said she called the police on me while the pump was running. I said, "Yes." She said, "Before the transaction was complete." I said, "Yes." She said, "I want to be precise about what I want from this." I said, "Tell me." She said, "I want the 911 call recording. I want David's statement. I want Officer Reeves's report. I want the gas station security camera footage if the station will provide it. I want the pump's transaction log if the station's management will pull it. And I want Karen's complete complaint history with the HOA because that pattern is going to matter." I said, "I have 61 entries in the HOA documentation file." She said, "I know. I need it in format Renata can use." I spent the following morning organizing the 61-entry documentation file into the format Renata needed, categorized by type of incident, dated, with cross-references to HOA board correspondence and any written responses. Renata filed the public records request for the 911 call recording that same morning. The request also covered any records related to the officer response, the incident report, and any prior 911 calls from the same caller number related to our address or Nadia's name. That last category produced something we had not anticipated. The prior calls. There had been 2, both within the preceding 14 months, both from Karen's phone number. The first, at month 8, had reported a suspicious vehicle parked on our street, our vehicle, as it turned out, which had been parked legally in front of our house. The officer who had responded had noted in his report that the vehicle was legally parked and the owner was a resident of the address. The second, at month 11, had reported what Karen had described as a potential domestic disturbance at our address. The officer who responded had knocked on our door, I had answered, and had noted in his report that there was no disturbance and that the resident had been cooperative. I had not known about either of these calls. We had not been notified. The officer at month 11 had said only that he was doing a routine check of the area and had not mentioned a 911 call. Renata reviewed the 3 calls, month 8, month 11, and month 14 at the gas station, alongside the 61-entry HOA documentation. She called me after reviewing everything. She said, "This is not a gas station incident. This is a 14-month pattern of using law enforcement as an instrument." I said, "Yes." She said, "The gas station is the most legally significant because it resulted in a documented response to a transaction that was completed before the officer arrived. But the prior calls established the pattern." I said, "What are the legal dimensions?" She said, "Several. Filing a false police report is a criminal matter. In this state, knowingly making a false report to law enforcement is a misdemeanor, and the specificity of what Karen told the dispatcher, combined with the receipt demonstrating the transaction was completed before the call, gives the DA's office a clear factual record." She paused. "The civil dimensions are more significant. Malicious prosecution, abuse of process, and the civil rights dimensions of a pattern of calling law enforcement on a person because of their race. That's a Section 1983 claim if she was acting under color of law, which she wasn't, but it's a state civil rights claim if the pattern supports an inference of discriminatory intent." I said, "Does the pattern support that inference?" She was quiet for a moment. The pharmacy comment, the school parking lot report, the neighborhood gathering comment about the people who moved into Thornfield Court, 3 911 calls in 14 months, all targeting you or Nadia, 7 HOA complaints in 14 months, all targeting your property, all dismissed. She paused. Individually, any one of these is ambiguous. Together, the pattern is Nadia knows what it says better than I do. I said, "What does Nadia want to do?" Renata said, "She wants to have a conversation with you before we decide." The conversation happened that evening. Nadia and I sat at the kitchen table, the same table she had sat at the previous afternoon. And I laid out what Renata had told me. Nadia listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. She said, "I've handled these cases for 18 years. I know what the pattern looks like. I know what it means. I also know what it costs to pursue, the time, the exposure, the way it follows you even when you win." She looked at her hands. "I'm tired of knowing all of that professionally and having it be mine personally." I said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I want her to understand what she did. Not an apology I don't believe. Not a settlement check that feels like she bought her way out. I want her to understand, in a format that is documented and public and cannot be revised later, what she did and what it was." I said, "A formal legal proceeding?" She said, "Yes, civil suit, the false police report complaint to the DA, the HOA formal complaint with the complete 14-month pattern as evidence." She paused, "and the security camera footage." The Sunoco station management had been cooperative. The station manager, a woman named Gloria who had managed the location for 8 years, had reviewed the security camera footage on the Wednesday after the incident and had called Renata to offer a copy voluntarily. She said, and I am quoting her exact words as recorded in Renata's notes from the call, that she had been managing gas stations for a long time and had seen this kind of call before, and was not going to let her station's records be unavailable for someone who needed them. The footage showed everything: Nadia arriving, Nadia at the pump, the first card attempt, the second card attempt, the pump running, the nozzle in the tank, the fill completing, the nozzle returned, the receipt printing. And Karen at pump 9 on her phone. The footage had a timestamp overlay. Karen's call to 911 was logged by the carrier at 2:41. The footage timestamp showed Karen on her phone at 2:41 and 23 seconds. The pump receipt printed at 2:43 and 8 seconds. 1 minute 45 seconds of a pump running, completing a transaction and printing a receipt. While Karen was on the phone with 911 reporting a theft. Renata filed the civil suit the following week. The complaint was 31 pages. It documented the 3 911 calls, the 7 HOA complaints, the pharmacy incident, the school parking lot report, the neighborhood gathering comment, and the gas station incident with its complete documentary record, the footage, the receipt, the pump's transaction log, David's statement, Officer Reeves's report, and the 911 call recording. The complaint alleged false police report, malicious prosecution, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violations of New Jersey's law against discrimination in the specific context of using law enforcement as an instrument against a person because of their race. The DA's office received the criminal referral simultaneously. Renata had coordinated the filing. The HOA formal complaint went to Patricia Osai the same day. Patricia called me the morning after she received it. She said 61 entries. I said 14 months. She said, and the 3 911 calls. I said yes. She said, I've been board president for 4 years. I've dismissed 7 complaints from Karen about your property. I kept the file because the pattern was documentable. She paused. I didn't know about the 911 calls. I said, we didn't know about the first 2 until the public records request. She was quiet for a moment. The gas station. I said, she called while the pump was still running. She said, the receipt was in Nadia's hand when the officer arrived. I said, yes. She said, I'm calling a board meeting. I want the membership to have the complete picture. The board meeting was the following Thursday. 34 of 41 households attended. Patricia presented the complete documentation with the organized clarity of a former teacher delivering a lesson she wanted every student in the room to understand. She presented the 14-month HOA complaint history, 7 complaints, all dismissed, all documented. She presented the 3 911 call records. She presented the gas station incident documentation, including the timestamp overlap between the 911 call and the pump's transaction log. She showed the security camera footage on the community center screen. The room watched Karen pick up her phone at pump 9 at 2:41 and 23 seconds. The room watched the pump at pump 7 continue running. The room watched the receipt print at 2:43 and 8 seconds. Nobody said anything for approximately 20 seconds. Then a man named Theodore Chen, who had lived in Thornfield Crossing for 12 years and had been on the HOA board before Patricia, said she called the police while the pump was still running. Patricia said yes. Theodore said before the transaction was complete. Patricia said 1 minute 45 seconds before. The room was quiet again. A woman named Sandra Park, who had attended Karen's previous HOA hearings and had been sympathetic to her concerns, said, "I didn't know about the other 911 calls." Patricia said, "No one outside the police department and our household knew about the prior calls until the public records request." Sandra said nothing else. The board voted formal censure of Karen Whitmore Aldridge for conduct unbecoming a community member, specifically for a pattern of filing false or unsupported complaints to law enforcement and to the HOA board targeting specific neighbors, 5-0. A formal referral of the HOA's complete complaint documentation to the civil proceedings Nadia had initiated, 5-0. A formal statement of the board's support for the affected household's pursuit of all available legal remedies, 5-0. Karen had not attended. Her attorney had sent a letter requesting postponement. Patricia had declined. Karen's husband James came to the meeting. He sat in the back row and did not speak during any of the presentations or the voting. As people filed out, he remained seated. I waited. He came to find me when the room was nearly empty. He was a structural engineer for a regional infrastructure firm, quiet and methodical, and had been almost entirely absent from the foreground of the 14 months that had preceded this conversation. He said, "I owe you and Nadia a conversation I should have had earlier." I said, "Tell me." He said, "I knew about the HOA complaints. Karen told me she had concerns about the new neighbor's compliance with community standards and that she was raising them through the appropriate channels. I told myself that the board was the appropriate filter, and if they dismissed them, they would stop." He looked at the empty community center. They kept coming. I said, 7 in 14 months. He said, "Yes, I should have said something after the third." I said, "What about the 911 calls?" He said, "I didn't know. I didn't know until Karen's attorney called me after the civil complaint was filed. She told the attorney it had been. She described the pharmacy and the school as misunderstandings and the gas station as a genuine concern she had acted on in good faith." He stopped. She was watching a black woman have difficulty with a card reader and she called 911. He stopped. He said, "I don't know what she told herself that made that the right response. I've been trying to understand it since the attorney called me. I can't understand it." I said, "It's a 14-month pattern. It didn't start with the card reader." He said, "No, it didn't." He looked at me. "I'm sorry. What Karen did to Nadia at that gas station, what she has been doing for 14 months, I am sorry. I should have seen it and I should have stopped it." I said, "I appreciate that." He said, "Is there anything? I know the legal matters are the legal matters. I know James means the civil suit and the criminal referral are not mine to resolve. Is there is there a conversation Nadia would want to have?" I said, "I'll ask her." Nadia, when I described the conversation, was quiet for a long time. She said, "He wants to understand." I said, "I think so." She said, "That's different from wanting to resolve it." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'll talk to him." The conversation between Nadia and James happened the following Saturday at our kitchen table. I was present. It lasted an hour and 40 minutes, and I am not going to characterize its entire content because some of it belongs to the people who were in the room and not to this account. What I will say is that Nadia, who had been handling cases like this for 18 years and who had never been able to be present in those cases the way she was present in this one, said things that I think she had needed to say in that format, not to a judge, not to a jury, not to a client's family, but to someone who was sitting across a table and listening without a prepared defense. James listened. He did not defend. He asked two questions, both of which were clarifying rather than challenging. At the end, he said he was going to go home and have a conversation with his wife that he had not been able to have before and that he was going to have it now. He left. Nadia sat at the table for a while after. She said, "I don't know if it changes anything." I said, "It doesn't have to change the legal proceedings." She said, "No, it doesn't." She looked at her coffee mug, "But it changed something." The legal proceedings resolved across 4 months. The criminal matter, the false police report, was addressed by the DA's office through a formal caution and a diversion program, declining to prosecute on the condition that Karen completed a cultural competency and implicit bias program, paid a fine, and had no further law enforcement interactions for 18 months. The DA's office explained their decision to Renata. The evidence supported the charge, but the office's resources were directed at cases where prosecution was necessary for community safety. Renata had anticipated this outcome. The criminal referral had served its purpose. It was on the record, it had been reviewed and found credible, and the condition attached to the diversion would follow Karen in any future interaction. The civil matter resolved through a settlement that Renata negotiated over 6 weeks. The terms were confidential in their financial specifics. They were not confidential in their structural requirements. The structural requirements included a written acknowledgement, signed by Karen, notarized, filed with the court, that she had made reports to law enforcement regarding Nadia without factual basis, that those reports had caused harm, and that the pattern of reports and complaints over 14 months had targeted our household without legitimate justification. She signed it. Renata had told her attorney that the acknowledgement was not negotiable. 3 rounds of negotiation had attempted to soften its language. Each time, Renata had held the original language. Karen signed the original language. The HOA board received a copy of the signed acknowledgement per the terms of the settlement. Patricia filed it in the board's permanent records. Patricia called me when she received it. She said, "It's signed." I said, "Yes." She said, "The language." I said, "Renata held firm." She said, "It says, without factual basis." I said, "Yes." She said, "And targeted our household without legitimate justification." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Nadia handled 18 years of cases like this for other people. How is she? I said, "She's handling it." Patricia said, "That's not quite an answer." I said, "No, but it's honest." Nadia was handling it the way she handled everything she took seriously, methodically, with full attention, without pretending the difficulty wasn't difficulty. The gas station was not going to stop being the gas station because of a settlement. The acknowledgement was true and documented and permanent, but it did not undo 241 on a Tuesday afternoon. What it did was make the truth part of the record, which was, as Nadia had said 14 months ago at the kitchen table, what she wanted. Karen's house went on the market in month 3 of the settlement process. I do not know whether the decision was related to the proceedings or to something else, and I did not ask. James had told me at our kitchen table that he had needed to have a conversation with his wife. The house going on the market suggested the conversation had produced a conclusion. It sold in 47 days. The buyers were a couple in their early 30s, a pediatric dentist and a middle school science teacher, who introduced themselves on a Sunday afternoon with a plate of cookies and the uncomplicated warmth of people who had found a place to live and were glad about it. They said they hoped to be good neighbors. I said we hoped the same. Maya came to the door when she heard voices. She looked at the new neighbors and then at me. She said, "Are they nice?" I said, "They seem to be." She said, "Good." She went back upstairs. I stood in the doorway for a moment after the new neighbors left. The afternoon was the specific quality of late October in the mid-Atlantic, cooling, the leaves at their edge, the light at the angle that makes everything visible clearly. Nadia came to stand beside me. She said, "New neighbors." I said, "Seem good." She said, "Good." We stood there for a moment. I said, "The receipt." She said, "What about it?" I said, "You were holding it when the officer arrived." She said, 243, 6742, visa ending in 4891, approved. I said, "The most important receipt you've ever printed." She said, "It was a receipt for gasoline." I said, "It was a receipt that documented a completed transaction before a 911 call could claim otherwise." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Officer Reeves said he and his partner struggled to maintain appropriate professional composure." I said, "That's what the statement said." She said, "I've thought about that a lot." I said, "Yes." She said, "I think what he meant was that the situation was so clearly without basis that the professional response was the only thing preventing a less professional one." I said, "That's how I read it." She said, "That's what the receipt did. It made the situation so clear that there was nothing left to dispute." I said, "Documentation does that." She looked at the street. The new neighbor's car was in their driveway, a normal Tuesday afternoon street, the specific ordinary quality of a neighborhood that had been, for 14 months, less ordinary than it looked. She said, "I'm going to be all right." I said, "I know." She said, "Not yet, but I'm going to be." I said, "Yes." The receipt was in the documentation file. Behind the 911 call recording and the security camera footage and Officer Reeves's report and David's statement and Renata's 31-page civil complaint and the signed acknowledgement. $67.42. Approved. The most important document in 14 months of documentation. Because sometimes the truth of a situation is printed on a 2-inch piece of thermal paper by a pump at a gas station on Crestwood Boulevard. And sometimes the police arrive 1 minute and 45 seconds too late to dispute it. And sometimes that is exactly enough. Framed thumbnail text. She called 911 while the pump was still running. The receipt said otherwise.